On October 30th, 1918, the Ottoman government, represented by a naval officer, a rather junior figure actually in the Ottoman military, his name was Rauf Orbe, negotiated an armistice with the British on board the ship known as the Agamemnon. It was, in effect, the instruments of surrender. But it's significant to note that this armistice, known as the Armistice of Mudros, which is named after the Greek island where the instruments of surrender were signed, did not mark the end of the Ottoman Empire. It simply marked the cessation of hostilities, and it drew up armistice lines. Nor did the later treaties negotiated by the victors with the Ottoman Empire, that is the Treaty of Sèvres, on August 10th, 1920, and the later treaty that really ended the war, the Treaty of Lausanne, July 24th, 1923, neither of those treaties also marked the end of the Ottoman Empire. Even though the second treaty was concluded by representatives of a National Assembly in Ankara, who essentially represented themselves as Turkey rather than the Ottoman Empire, but it was a National Assembly still operating under the Constitution of 1876, the first parliament that had been summoned by Sultan Abdulhamid II. And so it's important to note that the First World War did not lead to the inevitable collapse of the Ottoman state. That was by no means clear. It would be only on the 29th of October in 1923 when a Turkish republic was proclaimed in the core of the old Ottoman Empire, and where one can actually say that the Ottoman Empire came to an end. Although there was still a caliph resident in Constantinople until March 3rd, 1924. And so it's we must be very, very careful not to assume that defeat in the First World War meant the end of the Ottoman state. That's not true. And it was by no means inevitable to the participants between 1918 and 1924 that the Ottoman Empire would pass into history. The second important point to keep in mind is that the man who was so important in bringing about the Turkish Republic, Mustafa Kemal, later named Ataturk, a title meaning all Turk, father of all Turks, which was voted to him by a very grateful parliament in 1934, was by no means the mastermind behind all of the events. And it's very, very easy to slip into hagiography rather than biography and attribute to Mustafa Kemal all sorts of plans to lay the foundations of a republic as early as 1918, or even earlier in his career when he was probably a junior member, a member of the second tier of the CUP, that is, the officers and bureaucrats who had established that committee back in 1906 for the reform of the Ottoman state and had taken power in 1908 and reasserted their power in the coup on January 23rd, 1913. Many of the events that follow the Treaty of Mudros were by no means inevitable, and Mustafa Kemal was reacting to events as much as everyone else. He turned out to be a brilliant man. Well, he always was a brilliant man, but his moves after 1919 eventually ensured the emergence of a republic, a new state on the ruins of the Ottoman Empire, and we will deal with that in a subsequent lecture. But in this lecture, it's important to remember that Mustafa Kemal was one of a number of leaders of what was then a nationalist movement to throw the Greeks and the British out of Anatolia rather than to dismantle the Ottoman Empire and create a republic. To understand the events that led to the conclusion of the Treaty of Lausanne on July 24th, 1923, it's important to look at three related set of events. The first are the events going on in the city of Constantinople, where the Sultan Mehmed VI established a new transitional government soon after the armistice was signed on October 30th, 1918. And as you recall, the breakthrough that was made by, or the breakout that was made by Allied forces in Bulgaria had forced the CUP cabinet to resign, first with Enver Pasha on the 4th of October, 1918, and then all of his colleagues 10 days later. And they essentially went into self-imposed exile. Meanwhile, the Sultan put together a transitional cabinet, picked negotiators to come to some kind of terms with the British on the Agamemnon, and they also found Sir Charles Townshend. As you recall, he was the British commander of the expedition to Kut that had surrendered back in April of 1916. And he was an exile living comfortably, or a prisoner of war living comfortably, in the city of Kastamonu. And he was brought out of captivity to act as a liaison between the British and the Ottoman state. Great Britain was represented by the admiral of the squadron in the Aegean. He has a marvelous name known as Somerset Gow Calthorpe. And Calthorpe was a very, very good negotiator, and the Ottoman representatives were really out of their depth. The British pushed a hard bargain. They wore down the negotiators, and the armistice that was agreed upon was really very, very favorable to the Allies, but the Ottoman state had very little choice. It is often speculated that better diplomats may have been able to extort a better deal out of the British for several reasons. First, Germany had not yet been defeated, and Germany would not surrender or sign an armistice until November 11th, after the absolute collapse of the Western Front. Furthermore, the British were very eager to conclude this war, lest the French and Italians stake out claims in the former Ottoman Empire. And so a more expert negotiator with a better command of English and British interest might have secured a better armistice. Nonetheless, the armistice did bring an end to the incredibly destructive fighting. And I think the Ottoman government was more or less relieved that the fighting was over. There were a number of preliminary agreements in the armistice that would then feed into the eventual treaty that was dictated by the Allies on August 10th in 1920. And these provisions turned out to be really a poisoned legacy for the Allies because it would galvanize in time Turkish resistance to Allied oppression. First and foremost was the fact that the Ottoman army had to essentially vacate the Arab provinces and all of those conquests in the Caucasus that had been made in early 1918 at the expense of Russia. The second important provision was the establishment of potential spheres of influence for the Allies. It was already indicated that the city of Constantinople and the Straits would come under some kind of British international administration, that is, the Royal Navy. And furthermore, the Italians, the Greeks, and French would all be able to stake out areas. It was also assumed that the small Armenian Republic, centered in Yerevan, which is in former Russian territory and had proclaimed its independence during the Russian Civil War, that it would receive large districts of eastern Anatolia, regions where the Armenians had been resident until they were deported back in 1915, 1916. Furthermore, there were even talks of sketching out a Kurdistan in the eastern provinces. And so the armistice included a number of major territorial concessions on behalf of the Ottoman state. The southern border of this truncated Ottoman Empire, which would run across Syria. There were disputes exactly what would be involved. Would Mosul be included in the Allied zone? Would it be included in the remaining territories of the Ottoman Empire? It was also indicated, however, that the Allied powers in this notorious Clause 6 could intervene and occupy any position, any strategic port, nexus of a railroad, or major city in order to implement the armistice. And that would later be invoked by the Greeks and the Italians to occupy the cities of Izmir and Antalya, respectively, in 1919, both of which turned out to be major blunders. In addition, the Sultan was to stay in power and was to dismiss the CUP ministers, well, they already had fled, dissolve the CUP and the Young Turk party, or committee, that was to be banned, and also allow the establishment of a Supreme Allied Council in the city of Constantinople, which took power on December 8th. And this council would handle the security in Constantinople as well as the Straits. It was also expected that trials would take place for war crimes committed by the Ottoman government, in particular the deportation and the massacre of Armenians, as well as other alleged war crimes. And all of these terms were agreed to by the Sultan, who really had very little choice and still hoped to preserve his throne. He perhaps styled an idea that without the CUP, he could assert himself. He appointed a reasonably moderate chief vizier, grand vizier, Ismet Pasha, who actually served in the old government of Sultan Abdul Hamid II. And he knew the British predilection for dealing with monarchs, and he hoped that he could preserve his throne in the family of Osman in a truncated Ottoman Empire. The arrangements at the Treaty of Mudros, on the other hand, did not go over well with the general population in Anatolia. And this included many officers who had fought in the First World War, who represented men who were the second or third tier leadership of the CUP or the Young Turks. Sometimes we call them Unionists. There's a number of terms you can use. And they looked at alarm at what was going on in Constantinople. The Sultan dissolved the parliament. There were new elections. A new parliament took power in March of 1919. The Sultan appointed a new Grand Vizier. It was his brother-in-law, Ferhat Pasha, who was very, very much in favor in maintaining the position of the Sultan. And they were dutifully carrying out the demands of the Allies, which would lead eventually to the Treaty of Sèvres. Under those circumstances, enormous amount of popular resistance arose in Constantinople when that new parliament convened in the spring of 1919. And some of that was brought on by the publication of the Sykes-Picot Agreement, as well as other secret agreements, thank you, Leon Trotsky, that then circulated among the political classes in Constantinople, along with the preliminary terms of the armistice that indicated that the Ottoman Empire was going to be cut apart and partitioned, just as the other Axis powers. And the rising demonstrations and protests led the Allies to crack down on resistance, to suspend the press, and the British, in a sense, imposed a martial law. All of that contributed to alienating the political classes, and meanwhile, Mehmet VI and his brother-in-law, Damat Ferid, were trying to come to some kind of arrangement with the Allies in order to preserve his throne. Well, this requires us to shift from Constantinople now to Anatolia. Let's recall Mustafa Kemal. He was not the only leader in the nationalist resistance that began to crystallize in Anatolia in early 1919 against the Allied demands and the Allied terms at the armistice. There were other leaders. One of them was Kazem Karbeker, a very important general. He, at the time, was commanding the 15th Corps in Erzurum. There was, of course, that naval officer himself, Orbey, or Rauf Orbey. There was Bele Pasha, another important associate of Mustafa Kemal, and all four of these men shared a certain common background. They were men born in the late 1870s, 1880s. They had gone through the military training and cabinets. They had been exposed to Western ideas of technology. Many of them had traveled as military attachés in Europe. They all knew French quite fluently, especially Mustafa Kemal. And if anyone goes and sees his mausoleum in Ankara today, you're astonished at the range of his library by the end of his death. Furthermore, these officers were committed to 2 points: the unity of the empire and the modernization of the empire to preserve independence from the Allies. They were disagreeing on a lot of other issues, like should there be a caliph, a sultan, a republic. But at this point, they all agreed on those points. Mustafa Kemal, as you recall, was handed over command of the remaining Turkish forces, Ottoman forces in Syria, and then was summoned back to Constantinople on September 12, 1918. And he did arrive 5 days on September 17th, and began to renew ties with all of his old officers from the CUP. He, as well as his associates, were not covered under the Allied demands to get rid of the CUP cabinet. They were not sufficiently high in the old government to merit that sort of treatment. And in fact, Mustafa Kemal received a commission from the Sultan to go and handle the demobilization of the military forces in Asia Minor under the terms of the armistice. And he landed in the city of Samsun on May 19th, 1919, to take over his commission. When he landed, two events had galvanized opposition in Anatolia. One was that the Greeks occupied the city of Smyrna, or Izmir, on the Aegean shore, assisted by both British and American warships that landed these forces, and took over Izmir in the name of Article 6, that article in the armistice that was very, very notorious and allowed any Allied force to seize any position in the interest of security. And clearly the Greeks came to stay. They intended to annex Smyrna and take over Western Asia Minor and incorporate it into a greater Greece. This was clearly the plan of Venizelos, the prime minister of Greece at the time, and the new king Alexander, and it was backed by David Lloyd George, the prime minister of Britain, who thought that the Greeks could be used as the proxies to dominate Asia Minor and the Eastern Mediterranean. So that had raised a great deal of resentment in Asia Minor. Second, Mustafa Kemal encountered all of these self-defense groups, various former commanders and associates who were ready to establish order in Anatolia and resist the Greeks. And that allowed him to get in touch with his old friend, Kazım Karabekir, and they agreed to hold a Congress at the city of Erzurum in July of 1919. Now, this is still looked upon as essentially the first parliament or assembly, national assembly of the Turkish Republic. It stayed in session from in July and early August of 1919. It finally dissolved on August 4th. And it had a regional representation in which the various representatives did two things. They announced a national pact. And this national pact is still invoked in Turkey today. And there were several provisions of it. The first and foremost was that the integrity of Turkey should not be compromised in any of the negotiations. The Milli Misak, that is the national agreement. And furthermore, Anatolia was the homeland, and there would be absolutely no deals with Greeks and Armenians and staking out large sections of that territory for Greece and Armenia. And this was an embodiment of all of that national literature going back before the First World War. This was the heartland of the Turks now. End of story. The second important point is that this National Assembly protested its loyalty to the Sultan in Constantinople, Mehmed VI. It was not a revolution. It did not proclaim the overthrow of the Ottoman Empire. It met again as a larger body on September 4th to the 11th, 1919, at the city of Sivas in central Turkey today. And that building has been preserved as a museum. And once again, the National Pact, the Milli Misak, was again enacted in stronger terms, as well as loyalty to the Sultan. Now, Mehmed VI didn't know what to do with these guys. Mustafa Kemal had been elected as the spokesman, the first speaker of both of these congresses. He and his Grand Vizier were uncertain about what this would do because these proclamations meant a renewal of war with the Allies, and the Greeks had already landed in Izmir and were taking over parts of Western Asia Minor. And so the Sultan's position was one of largely hostility. And he tried to arrange some sort of deal with these nationalists, who are sometimes called Kemalists, after the name of Mustafa Kemal. And that's a bit misleading, because at this point, Mustafa Kemal is one of a number of leaders. He was the main spokesman in the parliament, but he clearly was not the undisputed leader of the nationalist opposition that was now forming. A compromise was worked out at Amasya in the fall of 1919. There were new elections to call a new parliament in Constantinople that convened on January 12th in 1920. And of course, the nationalists won a majority. And when I say the nationalists convened, it's a very, very loose coalition of different groups simply opposed to the Allies and opposed to any kind of compromise on the integrity of the Ottoman state, as well as objections to the Greeks who were now in the area of Izmir and expanding their control in the Meander Valley, or as it would be now known in Turkish, Gedizchaya, and wanted an accounting for what the Allies intended to do in their final treaty. Above all, they were very, very suspicious of Allied mandates and spheres of influence as an indirect way of cutting Turkey up into essentially a set of colonies. That parliament passed all sorts of resolutions condemning the Allies. And meanwhile, in December of 1919, Ataturk had relocated to Ankara and began to organize military resistance and direct the opposition in Constantinople. On December 19th, 1919, Mustafa Kemal had moved his representative committee of the Congress in Sivas to Ankara. Ankara was at the end of the railway line running east from Constantinople, and it was at the time a rather sleepy town of perhaps 30,000. It's on the Anatolian plateau, and it would be very difficult for any Allied or Greek army to reach it. He began to organize national resistance among various veterans from the First World War, and that's a significant point to keep in mind. The Ottoman army had trained the army that would fight for the Turkish War of Independence, as it's now called. Many of the veterans had organized into self-defense groups. The officers were all experienced from the fighting of the First World War. And while it looked like a rather ragtag army, it was actually very well trained, and certainly superior in its drill and its motivation than the opposing Greek forces that we'll see later in this lecture. The move to Ankara proved important because when the new parliament convened on January 12, 1920 in Constantinople, it passed resolutions condemning Allied actions and demanding a far fairer peace based on the 14 points of Woodrow Wilson. There was even speculation that the U.S. should take over the running of the Ottoman Empire to transition it from a war situation to a peaceful state. That never went off, but nonetheless, it shows some of the expectations of the defeated Ottoman soldiers and politicians that they expected to be treated fairly in the negotiations. They had fought well in the First World War, and they had agreed to an armistice, and they didn't expect to be treated as simply some kind of potential colony. The result was clashes between the Supreme Allied Council and the Parliament, and eventually, on March 18th, 1920, the Parliament passed a unanimous resolution condemning the Allies and the feared final treaty arrangements and dissolved. Mustafa Kemal found out by telegraph the next day, and on March 20th, he announced new elections. The elections returned a National Assembly that met in Ankara. At this point, Mustafa Kemal had just pulled off a brilliant constitutional ploy. The representative government of the Turkish population was now in Ankara, and it still protested its loyalty to the Sultan, but the government was now centered in Ankara, and Mustafa Kemal took the position as the first speaker of that National Assembly that eventually convened in April of 1920. It is from here in Ankara that Mustafa Kemal and his associates could coordinate the resistance against the Greeks in Asia Minor, and ultimately against the British interest as promoted by David Lloyd George, the Prime Minister of Britain, and the Foreign Secretary, Lord Curzon, who many of you might know from his position as Governor General in India earlier. This was a turning point once the national government centered itself in Ankara. Mehmet VI really gave no support to it. He even secured a fatwa at one point to condemn the nationalists, but the resistance was on. The Greeks were really in a very, very poor position to impose their demands on Western Asia Minor. And at best, the city of Izmir, when the Greeks occupied it in 1919, was at the most generous count 45% Greek. And as the Greeks tried to expand their area with the approval of Lloyd George, they were moving into areas that were overwhelmingly Turkish in northwestern Turkey and in the Meander Valley, which is in central Turkey today. And they began to carry out essentially acts of ethnic cleansing and massacres and atrocities that came to the attention of the Western press. And so the Greeks were very, very difficult allies for many of the British to agree to continue to support. Furthermore, the Greek army, as it moved more and more into Asia Minor, extended its lines. In Ankara, Mustafa Kemal and his associates framed a very, very effective strategy that eventually defeated the Greek invasion. First, they avoided major battles until the army was sufficiently strong. And the main battles were really not fought until 1921, as the Greeks gobbled up more real estate and extended their logistical lines and really lacked the transportation and organization to conquer Asia Minor and support this army that rose to about 100,000 by the time of the end of the war. Second, the nationalists also settled their eastern frontiers. They came to a very quick conclusion with the Soviets and essentially signed off on the borders that now exist in eastern Turkey, turning over certain areas, but recovering two of the three provinces lost in 1878. That was Kars and Ardahan. They also dealt with the French, who had territorial aspirations to the southeast. There was a treaty signed in Ankara in October of 1921 that essentially settled the border between the French Mandate of Syria and what was to become the Turkish Republic in time. And that allowed the nationalists to concentrate their forces against the Greeks and also to receive military aid from the Soviets. The Soviets saw Turkey as a bulwark in fighting the Allies who were attempting to undermine the Bolshevik regime in Moscow. And so Mustafa Kemal and the nationalists received military assistance, payments in gold, Soviet military attachés, who also proved very important in organizing the resistance in Ankara in 1921. In addition, both the French and the Italians were resentful of the Greeks and the British and lent no assistance to their former allies. And in fact, the Italians essentially evacuated their area of Asia Minor, which they would have gotten as a mandate, in return for some economic concessions, and handed over vast military stores to the nationalists because they resented the Greeks for moving into Izmir, which they actually saw originally as their territory. And as a result, the Greeks were on their own to fight this war with a divided leadership, especially after King Alexander died of a monkey bite on October 25th, 1920, and there was a whole change of government, purges of the officers. The Greeks were completely divided politically and militarily on what to do with this invasion, and the result was a series of battles in 1921 that halted the Greek advance. These were won largely by a fellow known as İsmet Pasha, later to be renamed İnönü, because he won the first two significant battles that checked the Greek advance at the town of İnönü in January and then in March of 1920. And by 1920, in the fall, the Greeks had essentially reached as far as they could get. And in the next year, the nationalists reorganized and launched a crushing attack in the summer of 1922, in August, at a town called Dumlupınar, which is just to the west of the city of Afyon today. Mustafa Kemal actually helped coordinate the attack. Ismet Pasha, the future Inunu, who would be the second president of Turkey later on, carried out a masterful plan, destroyed 2 Greek armies, and the Greeks were sent running back to Smyrna and Izmir in total defeat. They reached the city. The Greek populations, the Armenians, the foreign residents evacuated the city in total chaos on any kind of boat they could find. And on September 9th, 1922, the Turkish army reoccupied Izmir and imposed some kind of control. There were the usual excesses committed on both sides as the Greeks retreated to Izmir and as the Turks pursued. The most famous incident is the burning of Smyrna. Fires broke out on September 13th and raged through the city and were not put out until 9 days later and destroyed the ancient quarter. And there's still a lot of accusations on both sides as to who started the fires. The result was the Greek government had no choice but to agree to an armistice, and an armistice was signed at Mudanya, which is today a resort on the Sea of Marmara. It's known as the Armistice of Mudanya, and the Greeks essentially gave up. The Turkish army reoccupied Constantinople, secured eastern Thrace, and a conference was called to settle the war. This was an amazing victory on the part of the former, or what is still the Ottoman Empire. In contrast to the other Central Powers, Germany, Austria, Bulgaria, the Ottoman Empire reversed the very harsh demands that were issued at the Treaty of Sèvres back in 1920 and got a new treaty, which would be ratified in 1923. The victory, which was symbolized by the signing of the armistice, the reentrance of Ottoman forces into Constantinople on October 19th, that victory represented a triumph in the war. Mustafa Kemal had directed and surmounted a constitutional crisis. He had won a major war. Now it was for him to win the peace.